Back in action, U.S. airstrikes hit militant targets in northern Iraq. One down, one to go. A second major storm to skirt the Hawaiian Islands. Flashback 40 years. Facing impeachment and possible criminal charges, Nixon resigns. Just ducky. The Windy City Duck Derby helps fund Special Olympics. Those stories and more on EWTN News Nightly for Friday, August 8th, 2014. Good evening from Washington, D.C. Thanks for joining us. I'm Brian Patrick. As we look at your news now, just hours after the president authorized airstrikes to protect U.S. civilians and Iraqi refugees, U.S. warplanes bombed militant targets in northern Iraq. Our Wyatt Goolsby covers that story from the White House tonight. Wyatt?
Brian, the White House says the first U.S. airstrike against the terrorist group ISIS hit the group's artillery early this morning. Now, escalating America's military role is not something the president says he wants to do, but says it is something that's necessary in order to stop what could turn into genocide.
When many thousands of innocent civilians are faced with the danger of being wiped out, and we have the capacity to do something about it, we will take action.
The targeted airstrikes are focused on stopping terrorists from reaching Erbil, the capital of the Kurdish region. 2 U.S. fighter jets dropped 500-pound laser bombs outside the city, with more likely to continue. The U.S. is also airdropping aid to help thousands of Yazidis, a religious minority group persecuted by ISIS. The militants have given families of religious and ethnic minorities an ultimatum: convert or die. Today, President Obama called regional leaders like the King of Jordan to discuss the crisis. For the thousands of Christians forced to flee their homes, the U.S. taking action in the fight is welcomed.
We are happy, we are pleased with the airstrikes, and let them bring back our properties, and let our government find a proper solution for us.
But despite the U.S. support from the air, the humanitarian crisis on the ground continues for the thousands who have fled north. Pope Francis and Vatican officials are calling for help from the international community.
He wants to see multilateral action here, as much of the international community involved as possible, and in the past has certainly been willing to go along with that, never encouraging a war, but obviously if there is such defensive measures necessary to save people's lives.
One other announcement today from the Vatican on the Iraq crisis. We've learned that Pope Francis is sending the Vatican's ambassador in Baghdad during the Iraq war as his personal envoy to the region, and his purpose will be to show solidarity with the Christians suffering there. Brian?
Wyatt Goolsby at the White House. Thank you, Wyatt. Those fleeing persecution get another prayerful boost from Pope Francis, who is again using social media, in fact 3 times today, to share a message of peace. On his personal Twitter page this morning, the Holy Father tweeted, "I ask all men and women of goodwill to join me in praying for Iraqi Christians and all vulnerable populations." Then 3 hours later, he took to Twitter again, restating the plea. This time he used a trending hashtag to tap into a wider audience. His tweet: "Please take a moment today to pray for all those who have been forced from their homes in Iraq. Hashtag pray for peace." His Twitter activity doesn't end there. He then sent out a 3rd tweet today to those suffering in Iraq. The Holy Father tweeted, "Lord, we pray that you sustain those who have deprived everything in Iraq. Hashtag pray for peace." Nina Shea is director of Center for Religious Freedom at the Hudson Institute, joining us tonight. Give us some perspective, Nina. What are these Christians going through right now? How are they surviving? Where are they?
Brian, 100,000 Christians have been driven off the Nineveh plain into Kurdistan just this week. They have descended, many of them on foot, with nothing but the clothes on their backs, a few meager possessions. They've descended on Erbil, the capital of Kurdistan, and Dohuk, another city in Kurdistan. They have nothing. They're penniless. They weren't able to withdraw money from their bank accounts. And they are living under underpasses, in fields, cramming into churches, into schools, into auditoriums. There is nothing for them. They don't have air-conditioned tents. There is no module hut set up for them. There is just no room, and it's other groups as well, so you can imagine how difficult it is.
So those numbers applied to just this week, but this has been going on for weeks, even months. Finally, a U.S. airstrike overnight. You have written that for Christians to survive in that area, it's going to take an American response. Is this the appropriate response? Is it enough?
Well, there's an aid response that is very much needed for the Christians and other minorities that are displaced now in Kurdistan, because the airdrop that the U.S. is giving now is only for the Yazidis on a mountaintop in Nineveh. The rest of Nineveh has been evacuated, driven out by violence by the Islamic State, and these people now are in desperate need of food and water and medicines and the essentials of life, but also resettlement aid. They have nowhere to go. They've lost everything.
They have been in this land for 2,000 years, since the first century of Christianity. Is there a danger that this Christian presence will be completely wiped out?
Yes, this is religious cleansing. This is a crime against humanity. It is why people are calling it a genocide. It's the deliberate targeting of Christians and other minorities to get them out of the land, to eradicate their entire presence. Crosses are being taken down from churches. Some churches are being blown up and destroyed. Others are being turned into mosques. Ancient monuments, documents, thousands of ancient manuscripts and documents are being burned. The entire Christian presence is being eradicated.
Now, we heard Pope Francis asking for prayers. You actually got to meet him and talk about this.
Yes, I did. I spoke with the Holy Father in June in Rome and urged him to continue speaking up about the persecution of Christians in many parts of the Islamic world right now, especially in Iraq and Syria. He said to me that the persecution now against Christians is worse than in the first century, and that there are more martyrs today than there were back then.
Very strong statement, and thank you so much for your perspective. From the Hudson Institute, Nina Shea, thanks for joining us.
Thank you very much, Brian.
Now, some of the other stories our EWTN News Nightly team has been covering in today's world. Afghanistan's two presidential candidates have agreed to resolve an election dispute that's left the future leadership of that country in limbo. Secretary of State John Kerry announced the deal today in Kabul. Even though a presidential vote took place in mid-June, no official tally has been released. Both candidates say there was fraud in the election. Whichever candidate wins will negotiate with the U.S. and NATO members about the future role of military assistance with the country. If today's deal holds, an inauguration date for the new president could be set by the end of this month. Well, the fleeting period of calm is now over for the people of Gaza and southern Israel. The Israeli military said it carried out strikes on militant targets in Gaza today. The Israeli government says it was in response to a barrage of rocket fire after a three-day truce came to an end without a long-term agreement. The two sides have been engaged in ongoing talks in neighboring Egypt.
The Cairo talks are based on one crucial assumption, and that is unconditional ceasefire. The talks only started because there was a cessation of hostile fire. And by breaking the ceasefire, by reinitiating violence, by targeting our civilians as they've done this morning, it's clear that Hamas has broken the fundamental premise for these talks in Cairo.
Hamas, the Islamic militant group that holds power in Gaza, says Palestinian officials at the Cairo peace talks had not agreed to extend the truce, but they expressed a willingness to continue negotiations. Nigeria is declaring a national state of emergency over the Ebola virus, just as the World Health Organization says an extraordinary response is the only way to stop this growing outbreak. The WHO is declaring its own international emergency as the death toll now approaches 1,000. The international agency hopes greater global coordination will contain this outbreak.
The declaration of a public health emergency of international concern alerts the world to the need for high vigilance for possible cases of Ebola virus disease, but by no means implies that all countries, or even many countries, will see Ebola cases.
Ebola has mainly hit 3 countries in West Africa: Guinea, Sierra Leone, and Liberia. Samaritan's Purse, the group with 2 missionaries recovering from Ebola in Atlanta, calls the international response a failure. They say the outbreak could have been better contained months ago with effective use of international resources. Isel may have been downgraded from a hurricane, but now Tropical Storm Isel is still powerful after hitting Hawaii. Isel's eye hit the Big Island overnight, local time, but the heavy winds arrived well before that. So far, there have been no reports of any serious damage or injuries. Cleanup efforts will have to be quick or wait because Hurricane Julio is approaching and will likely hit the islands on Sunday. Julio is now a Category 3 storm, but is expected to lose some steam. Hawaii hasn't been hit by such powerful storms for 22 years. Florida's Attorney General is calling for state courts to halt cases on the redefinition of marriage that are being heard right now. The Attorney General wants the U.S. Supreme Court to decide if states have the right to ban so-called gay marriage. Judges in 4 counties are hearing appeals to the voter-approved constitutional amendments banning marriage between same-sex couples. 2 other states, Utah and Oklahoma, are also asking the Supreme Court to weigh in on this matter. Britain's Prince William is about to take on a new role, an air ambulance pilot. This is the first for the royal family, a direct heir to the throne with a civilian job. More from Susie Pinto.
Prince William is currently in what the palace describes as a transitional year, focusing on his royal and charitable work. But now he's decided what to do next. He's going back to work as an air ambulance pilot, and a spokesman says the prince is hugely excited and motivated. It'll also make him the first direct heir to the British throne to take a civilian job. The palace says he'll be donating his salary to charity. The prince will start training this autumn and is expected to qualify as a pilot next year. He'll do everything expected of a regular pilot, including night shifts, except that he'll be released for his key public duties.
Once we're actually on the job, I'll obviously get into the scene, land as close as I can to the patient. Once they're in back from the helicopter, I'll close the helicopter down and then provide security for the helicopter if it needs it.
Security is a concern that would have been considered carefully by the palace. There's concern it could expose the helicopter and crew to undue interest, perhaps hoax calls, though that wasn't a big problem in his previous role as a military search and rescue pilot.
It's rewarding because every day you come in to work and you don't quite know what's going to happen. It's quite exciting in that sense. It's unpredictable. But at the same time, it's great that you get to go out and actually save someone's life, hopefully, or at least make a difference to someone.
William was involved in more than 150 search and rescue operations as a military helicopter pilot, often out at sea. The East Anglian Air Ambulance Service is one of the busiest in the UK and operates over a diverse area, using whatever landing spots are closest to the patient. The job will also allow William to remain as a hands-on dad to his son and heir, Prince George, who just turned 1. The young family are currently renovating their idyllic country home on the Queen's Sandringham estate, just a short drive from the 2 airports William will be working from. The prince has always been keen on a role beyond his public duties as long as he's second in line to the throne. This new job allows him to balance both positions and have his family close by. Susie Pinto, EWTN News Nightly.
Coming up, who suffers the most from Russia's retaliatory ban on food imports from the West? And 40 years ago today, Richard Nixon resigned the presidency, but he lives on in cyberspace. On this Friday evening, thank you for joining us for EWTN News Nightly. I'm Brian Patrick. Russia's banning food imports from the U.S. and the European Union in response to international economic pressure could hurt its own people. As Catherine Elliott reports, the ban is likely to leave Russian store shelves bare.
The Russian government taking aim to put a chokehold on the global food market. Moscow announcing Thursday it would ban imports on almost all food products from Western nations. A move in retaliation for tough financial sanctions imposed on Russia by the U.S. and European Union. A penalty for its support of pro-Russian separatists in Ukraine.
President Putin is denying his own people food.
But Obama administration officials dismissed Putin's new sanctions as trivial to the U.S. Thursday, saying Putin's sanctions will only lead to bare shelves in Russian supermarkets.
So he has a choice to make. Either he can take actions that hurt his own people, or he can use the diplomatic off-ramp that we've always said exists and de-escalate and try to move forward in a different direction here.
In 2013, the U.S. sent just $1.3 billion in agricultural exports to Russia, about a quarter of that in poultry products.
The amount of exports to Russia is a small amount compared to the big picture, so the farmers affected will probably be able to find other markets.
But European farmers might see a bigger hit. Last year, the EU exported nearly $16 billion in agricultural goods to Russia, about 10% of its total food exports. Moscow warned that the food ban could spread to other restrictions, including limits on aircraft, cars, and other industrial products. Catherine Elliott, EWTN News Nightly.
Thank you, Catherine. It was 40 years ago today, August 8th, 1974, President Richard Nixon announced his resignation, effective the following day. This unprecedented announcement came after damaging new revelations in the Watergate scandal. Faced with impeachment and a possible criminal indictment, Nixon did what no other U.S. president has done: resign. Almost 10 years later, in an interview with former aide Frank Gannon, Nixon said the release of the so-called smoking gun tape transcript left him no options.
This was the final blow, the final nail in the coffin, although you don't need another nail if you're already in the coffin, which we were.
Shortly after his resignation, Nixon was granted a pardon by then-President Gerald Ford. Nixon died in 1994, but a Twitter reincarnation of the 37th president has thousands of followers. Twitter Nixon is apparently a New York playwright named Justin Sharon. He's captured Nixon's phrasing, his worldview, even his profanity. He sounds off on everything and lashes out at old enemies. During a recent interview, Sharon said he has long been fascinated by Nixon's weird and convoluted way of expressing himself. The Twitter feed combines historical and original material, in a sense bringing that former president back to life online. Some other cyber stories this week are raising questions about internet privacy. Earlier in the week, a security firm discovered that Russian hackers have stolen 1.2 billion usernames and passwords in a series of internet heists. To help consumers who are affected, that company will launch a website where people can see if their data has been breached. Also this week, a man is arrested after Google finds pornographic pictures on his phone and turns him in. The New York Times reports that Google uses an automatic search technique to track images of child pornography. Federal law requires all companies to report child exploitation. Shireen Mitchell is the Director of Web and Interactive Media for the Women's Media Center. Can you tell us, Shireen, about the technique that Google used in this bust?
Yeah, so they previously used a technique called hashing, and what they did this time is they actually gave a specific IP address to each of the pornographic pictures and used that against a database to determine whether or not it was child pornography, child sexual abuse, and at which point they tipped off the police and they came and arrested him. Now, they, of course, used the search warrant to do that first, but they ultimately arrested the man for having too much child sexual images on his machine.
Well, this, of course, seems to be a good thing in this case, but you wonder, are other companies able to monitor your private email like that?
Yes, they are. I mean, ultimately, when you're using Gmail, you know that you're getting ads targeted. That means that they're using search to determine what you are going to for websites and the messages you're sending. So actually, every social media site and website has some of the opportunities to do that. Yes, it's a violation of privacy when they decide to use it for getting you arrested. But in this case, there is laws on the books in reference to addressing child sexual abuse, and many companies have agreed to that, including Microsoft and Facebook and others.
Thank God they do. So when you check off that I agree to the policy, you're basically saying, yeah, you can go ahead and look at my emails if you want.
When you're giving,
most of us don't know that.
No, because when you're using a free service, you're actually giving over some of your content, and they're using it for ad targeting. That's how they make their money. Ultimately, at the end of the day, the real problem is Facebook's Messenger app, which actually gets access to your mobile phone and can do things like take pictures without your knowledge, make phone calls without your knowledge.
You call that the ultimate breach of
That's the
privacy.
ultimate breach of privacy, this new Messenger app, because you're not just giving an app access to your private information, which is who you contact, how many emails you send, how many times you call someone. It's also getting access to actually using your phone, and a malicious app can tie into that and then use your phone in the same way. Take pictures, make phone calls, whether you know it or not.
Do you think if people knew about all this, that they would behave differently?
They should. They should not download that Messenger app. It's amazing how many people have done it. I think it's about 1 billion people right now. And I think people need to pay a little bit more attention. I think there's about 74% of Americans are concerned about privacy. However, only 17% read the terms of service, the TOS. And if they knew exactly how much they were giving away, they may change some of their decisions on some of the apps they use. So with this Messenger app, I would never download that. I would tell people to remove it.
Eye-opening. From the Women's Media Center, Shireen Mitchell, thanks for being with us tonight.
Thank you.
Up next, what do tens of thousands of rubber ducks have to do with Special Olympics? And saving the puffin. The colorful birds are gradually disappearing from the northeast coast. On the 8th of August, a Friday evening, thanks for joining us. I'm Brian Patrick, and we welcome back Susan Crabtree, White House correspondent with the Washington Examiner. Let's look at some of this week's big stories, especially here in Washington. Today, we heard that bombs were dropped on northern Iraq, also some food drops for some of the refugees. Will this strategy of the White House work in northern Iraq?
Well, I think that they're trying to provide simple objectives to a very, very complex problem. And this would have been a much easier situation if they would have followed some lawmakers' advice from Capitol Hill, who said early on, 2 months ago, that we should have been using drone strikes to target ISIS and to really stop them before they started these atrocities and these mass murders of Christians and other ethnic minorities. And,
so now it might be a little too late.
That's right.
Also, the new VA bill is now law. The president just signed it. Is it enough to revamp the scandal-ridden Veterans Affairs Department?
Well, there's $16 billion in the bill. So yes, it's providing vital, needed money to hire clinicians and to create new clinics where there aren't any. But the problem really is that it's a culture of change that they need to, and a culture of accountability that they need to instill.
Can the new director do something about that?
Well, he's from Procter & Gamble, so he does have a corporate background that he's bringing to these challenges. So that's why one of the reasons why Obama hired him.
It'll be interesting to watch. Finally, I found this really interesting. You say that the Pentagon had an interest in the U.S.-Africa Leaders Summit?
That's right. The summit was about business ties and developing trade in Africa, because we're on the run. We need to compete with China there. But really, there's a quiet expansion of the U.S. military operations in Africa, and they would really like to move at some point the U.S. Africa Command Center to somewhere in Africa, because now it's in Stuttgart, Germany.
Which is interesting. Strange. Susan Crabtree, thanks for joining us from the Washington Examiner.
Thanks for having me.
All right, ducks for dollars. This is the 9th year now for Chicago's Duck Derby. Rubber duckies are sold to raise dollars for Special Olympics.
Today we're dropping 60,000 ducks off the Columbus Avenue Bridge to raise money and awareness for Special Olympics Illinois.
Yes, I'm very excited to see the ducks come down to the finish line.
The ducks are floated down the Chicago River as supporters and Special Olympians cheer them on. The Windy City Duck Derby raises more than $300,000 every year. That money is used to expand programs and opportunities for athletes with intellectual disabilities. And one group is using cameras for a cause. Our Catherine Zeltner reports on how some birds are now ready for their close-up.
Calling all bird lovers, or more specifically, puffin lovers. The Audubon Society is asking for help from avian enthusiasts on a new project to save the Atlantic puffins in coastal Maine. Known for their colorful beaks and clown-like appearance, there are only 1,000 pairs of the seabirds left in Maine. And the Audubon says the number of puffin chicks has declined in the last 2 years, most likely due to their food source leaving the area for cooler waters. But with the help of a puffin cam, Audubon officials like Steve Kress are able to keep tabs on key puffin habitats. Explore.org, an LA-based nonprofit that runs dozens of wildlife web cameras, is helping too.
So we began this great collaboration in 2012, in which we put 3 puffin cameras, high-definition cameras on the puffin nesting island called Seal Island National Wildlife Refuge.
This year, the Audubon is focusing their efforts on one puffin chick in particular that they have named Pal.
And little puffin Pal seems to be thriving, and we're documenting it. We're hoping that the food supplies remain strong, and the puffin Pal heads off to sea into the North Atlantic probably in about 2 weeks.
Kress thinks the project will teach a greater lesson on wildlife.
So this offers me great hope that people everywhere can help us as we learn about puffins, and through these cameras we can learn about how climate has affected the well-being of seabirds on remote islands.
The camera has already attracted more than 4 million views, giving birdwatching a whole new meaning. Catherine Zeltner, EWTN News Nightly.
Thank you, Catherine. I didn't realize how cute puffins are, especially Puffin Pal. Well, thank you for watching throughout the week. We'll see you on Monday. Until then, like us on Facebook, follow us on Twitter, watch again on EWTN's YouTube page. For all of us here at EWTN News Nightly, I'm Brian Patrick. Thanks for watching tonight and all week. Good night, and God bless you.